I'm Emily Page, and you're watching Start to Sold. And I am so excited to be here with Melissa Calicchia because she is an expert on food safety. And if you are a food and beverage entrepreneur and brand owner, you probably have a ton of questions about how to keep your product safe for consumers and how to protect yourself from liability. And she is the expert to speak with. Thank you for being here today, Melissa.
Thank you for having me, Emily. I'm very excited. I'm delighted that you asked me, and I'm delighted to impart any kind of help I can to new entrepreneurs and brand owners, people who are developing new and innovative foods. It's exciting to be in the industry and to watch people who are so creative create new and wonderful things. So I'm delighted.
Well, I know that you're passionate about what you do because you're constantly working to help people. And what people should know about you, to kind of get a background, is that not only are you a chief science officer at two different companies that you are a founder of, you have a number of different degrees. So the first company is Food Microbiological Laboratories, which does lab testing, and Food Safety Solutions, which is a consulting firm, so that when people have a problem and they need an executive level perspective of how to solve it, they can get consulting. Can you tell a little bit about your background so people know who you are and why they would contact each of those companies?
Yes. So my background is in microbiology and food science. Those are what my degrees are in. And I've applied those to the food industry, of course. And I worked in the food industry now for just about 35 years. And I've had the honor and the pleasure to work with so many different companies that are from startup companies all the way to billion-dollar companies. And I work with all of them. And with my microbiology background, I work a lot. I work heavily and apply that in food stability, how long the food lasts. Is it prematurely spoiling? I work a lot on food contamination. So is the food, has it become contaminated being processed and handled in our environment, or is it possible that ingredients are problematic? And we look at processes, we perform validation studies on food processes to verify if the resultant food is safe. And so I've spent the last 35 years really working on that throughout the industry.
Well, I know that as a fact because I have actually worked with you in different companies when I was both an employee and you were the expert coming to save the day for new products that we were developing for a cheese product, and you helped us to develop the COA. And then with my product company, we had an issue of mold on some packaging. We had to figure out if it was dangerous and if we could, how many products actually were contaminated. And so you saved the day, you and your team. So I know this for a fact. I can speak with a lot of authority about your authority on these topics. What we want to do today is share some of this knowledge with entrepreneurs and founders so that they can address the problems in their own life. And the truth of the matter is the average entrepreneur will not want to know every single thing that you know because it's just too much to become an expert. They want to be an expert in their product. But oftentimes a problem comes up, a vocabulary issue where you don't know how to solve a problem. And so we want to give enough information so that everyone knows where to find information. What do they need to know as a basic so that they can start to solve any problems that come up when they're developing a new product. So why don't we roll right into some questions?
Okay.
I think the first thing that we want to cover on this specific video is what is it that I would need to be aware of as a brand new beverage entrepreneur, food entrepreneur? What are the basics that I need to understand about food safety as I'm beginning to roll right into launching a new product?
Okay. Well, that's a great question. And I get asked that quite a lot by new entrepreneurs and people who are launching their businesses. And really the thing to understand is that above all else, the way our laws are written in the United States, and remember, United States, we have the safest food in the world. We do, despite the recalls and the outbreaks that are published in the United States, we do have the safest food in the world. And part of the reason for that is that we have such responsible business owners and entrepreneurs and product developers, project managers who are focused on food safety. And the other part is that Food and Drug, the regulatory agencies that govern foods, Food and Drug and USDA, are primarily focused on food safety, adulteration when it's contaminated with something that it shouldn't contain. The primary focus of their activities is to make sure the food is safe, it's wholesome, it contains what it says it does, and that there's not any sort of misbranding or misrepresentation in the market. And so that's why we have such safe products. So when we are developing our new products, or we're in the ideation process of new and particularly novel foods, we have to sometimes look at the boundaries and what is that food, what regulatory bucket would it really fit into, and who do we have to please? Who's our master? Is it USDA? Is it a meat and poultry item? Or a specific type of fish item? Or is it not that and it's something else and it's under FDA governance? So those are the key things we've got to ask. And then we ask other questions relative to the food, like is it a shelf-stable food product? And if there is, for example, a shelf-stable food product, it's under different regulatory bucket. So when we're developing different products and we're developing something like a fresh, let's say refrigerated or frozen bowl that has rice and vegetables and it may have meat in it or whatever, and then we have a shelf-stable sauce that's something that we're passionate about that's shelf-stable, why those are maybe under completely different regulatory buckets. And so there are different considerations when we're developing those products.
Okay, so as a person who on a regular basis is touching lots of different products in each of these categories, can we get, what would those categories be that we would need to, if we're in a certain category, then we have to go into a different bucket. So would that be, I guess that would be shelf stable, you said, was a bucket, has its own regulatory. Beef, so the USDA, which would
USDA,
that would be all meats, right?
Mm-hmm.
Except for poultry.
Yes, meat and poultry.
Okay, the FDA, which regulates food and drug?
Food and drugs, cosmetics too.
Cosmetics as well. Okay. What other buckets might influence the type of regulations that we have to submit to?
Well, within the FDA shelf stable, there can be what's called a low acid canned food. So that's something that is canned, that's been processed in a sterilization process, like a can of peas. Right? And the pH is neutral, meaning it would, if it wasn't sterilized, it might support the growth of Clostridium botulinum and could kill somebody. And so the low acid canned food regulation pertains to shelf stable foods where the pH is above 4.6. And then there's also another category for the shelf stable, which is acidified foods. And that's under FDA. And when it doesn't contain meat or poultry, right? And those are foods that are made shelf stable and they're safe with no temperature control by reasoning that the pH is low. They've been acidified. So that's a separate regulatory bucket, if you will, that's under FDA governance. And then if you have it gets a little more confusing because USDA handles all of the meat and poultry. So if you have a shelf-stable can of canned chili, for example, that has turkey in it, that's going to be under a USDA bucket, not under low-acid canned foods FDA, but under USDA canned foods shelf-stable. So we have to think about what we're what we're intending on developing, and understand who's our master, because then, and the reason we have to do that is because in all of our processing and handling, our food safety plans are relative to whichever agency we're under.
Cool. So that it sounds complicated because there are so many different non-intuitive regulatory umbrellas and laws that you need to submit yourself under, but that is a really good breakdown of general knowledge. Did you cover vegetables?
So vegetables are non-meat or poultry, right? So those are all under Food and Drug governance.
Okay.
All food and all produces.
Okay. Okay, so we generally know that if we are starting a new product, that we need to understand the category of the product that we are launching so that we can understand what laws there are. So those are the core categories. So after we figured that out, what types of things do we also need to be aware of as a food and beverage owner that will influence food safety?
Well, for example, when we're under FDA, so it's non-meat or poultry, we need to understand if we're doing a beverage product and it meets the FDA criteria of a juice. There is a juice HACCP rule, a juice food safety rule that pertains to juice. So FDA has very specific and important mandatory regulations that pertain to juice. So, and juice is defined by the agency, and sometimes it's not what you think it is. So if you have an orange juice, a fresh processed orange juice that's a beverage, it'll be under the FDA juice HACCP food safety rule. If you have something like a nut milk, let's say you have an almond milk that's refrigerated, fresh beverage, that's not under FDA juice HACCP rule. And so it's just under broad FDA, what we call preventive controls rule for all foods that aren't under another bucket. There are also, for example, FDA also has a seafood HACCP rule. So seafood HACCP is a food safety system that FDA mandates fish and fisheries products to be under that rule that's specific to seafood. So you have juice, you have seafood, you have non-juice and seafood, you have low acid canned foods for shelf stable, you have things other than shelf stable acidified foods rule. So everything else besides those things all fits into an FDA preventive controls rule. So if I have a potato chip that's shelf stable and it's a low moisture food, right? That's what makes it stable without temperature control. That's going to be under FDA, what's called preventive controls rule that governs good manufacturing practices and handling. But if I have a shelf stable fried pork rind, right, chicharrone, that comes from a meat or poultry, so that's under USDA. It's a snack food, but it's under USDA because it comes from meat and poultry. So when you understand those kind of rules of the road, it can help you know the governance will help you understand whose rules you've got to meet. If you're going to be meeting them, you need to understand them. If you're going to have a co-packer, for example, you would want to have them be compliant and versed and approved for those agencies as necessary.
I see. Okay, so in general, it's helpful to talk to your contract manufacturer about what the requirements are, because they most likely will be experts in some capacity, at least, about what the requirements for that category are, because if they're manufacturing in that category, they have to meet those to be able to be a manufacturer, they will have to submit to those things. So that's a
Yes.
good place to start for an entrepreneur to figure it out.
Yes, yes, that's a good place to start. Talk to contract manufacturers, talk to your project managers like yourself, talk to your formulators, your product development. If you use a consultant or a firm that works with product development and formulations, particularly, they can be great resources that can tell you, direct you to who does that sort of packaging
Yes, I love
process.
that. So I think the other things that you had mentioned to me before that are really important for an entrepreneur to get the basics gist of is nutritional analysis, nutritional panels, explain, which is something that it must be disclosed to the public, and ingredient decks, and also shelf life, which are things that I think a beginner wouldn't know what those things are. Could you give us a gist of what they are and why they're important?
Yes. So the of course the whichever agency we're processing under governs what the contents have to be on the label, and so those can be there's usually a principal display panel that says the name of the food, and oftentimes the name of the food even is governed by the agency. For example, USDA has very specific rules around what you can present something as and how reflective that is of the contents of something. And so if you name a food and what's in the food isn't primarily what the food is constituted of, then sometimes that's considered misbranding or misleading. And so there are some very specific rules around that. There are free guidance on those topics, on USDA websites and also on FDA websites. You can Google and get fact sheets. They're called fact sheets. FDA publishes, or guidance for industry, question and answer documents. Sometimes they call them question and answer around regulations. And they're a great free resource that can help you with the requirements to comply with those. And so there are question and answer sheets if you Google on acidified foods regulation. What do I need to do if I'm under the acidified foods regulation and I have a shelf-stable barbecue sauce that I want to manufacture, and it's my grandmother's recipe and everybody loves it and we make it at home all the time. Anyway, if I Google for those guidance on acidified foods rule, there are a lot of question and answer and all kinds of very basic breakdowns on what's required. And so all of those categories that I talked about have web-based guidance available to them. You can, again, also talk to your product developers, your project managers, people like myself, food scientists, great resources for all that stuff as well.
Yes. So what she has basically explained is that the category determines the packaging labeling. And so there's very specific laws that dictate serving sizes, the way that you describe the ingredients on the back. You can't just make it up the same way that you might, if you make a pie in a kitchen in your house, it's not the same way that you would report your ingredients. The recipe that you use at home is not the recipe that you use in a factory, and it's not the way that you report it publicly, because there's requirements about what you would call the flour and how you would use the right words. So all of that stuff is dictated by the government. And what about shelf life testing? So that's another thing that someone needs to realize, is that when they're launching a product, they need to be aware about how long that product is going to last. And I'm sure there's governing body rules about that as well. Do you want to tell them a little bit about it?
Yes, yes. Well, on a broad basis, what FDA and USDA require by law is that foods that are offered for sale in this country are wholesome. And what they mean by wholesome is that they don't contain something that they shouldn't, that's unsafe, and also that they're not spoiled. that they're not, they wouldn't be deleterious or harmful to human health. And so that shelf life or shelf stability, wholesomeness of a food is really that they demand that the food be wholesome when we consume it and when it's offered for sale. And when it's not, we can be subject to recall, right? And so it can be a big problem for us. And so that's the bottom line is they ask the industry, we as manufacturers and product developers and that, what they do is expect us as those entities that are designing that food and preparing and selling that food to understand and know what the endpoints on that food are. Where is its exhaustion point, or where is its failure point, so that our when the food is subject to spoilage and it can become unsafe, actually, if stored too long, that we know that there be an expiry date on that food, and that we know when that limit is, and we determine that limit usually by testing. So that's how it goes.
Right. So shelf life basically is something that everyone needs to have for their food or beverage product, and it will determine when a product is no longer safe. And often you can talk with your contract manufacturer and a lab like your lab to be able to figure out what those moments of expiration should be. But everyone needs to be aware that they need to have a shelf life plan for their product and be aware of what that is, so they can put it on their packaging, and also to figure out their inventory, how quickly they have to sell things.
Yeah, and Emily, besides the safety part of the shelf life, okay, so some products like those chips, shelf stable, those potato chips we talked about, why those are the safety of those, they're as safe the day they were manufactured as they will be over time, right? Their shelf life, their natural degradation during shelf life won't involve a safety-based endpoint. But it will certainly, there could be quality degradation, there could be flavor loss and things like development of rancidity, and where the fats start to oxidize and not the flavor isn't good, or the odor, develops an odor over time. I mean, there are quality endpoints too. So when we're developing a food and we're looking at what that shelf life endpoint is, the expiration date, the best by date, or the use by date, those are related to considerate of both quality and safety. And you usually have use by dates when there's a food safety concern that could develop after that. And then there's often a best by date if it's a quality attribute that would make the product ultimately unacceptable to the consumer, right? And that's really the difference between those definitions.
Cool. Okay, so those are really important for a person to not only protect themselves legally from liability of hurting someone. You would hate to have that ever happen with one of your products, but also for the quality to be something that a consumer would enjoy. So they have to think that through as a new brand owner. I think the last thing that you had on this list was the audit standards that actually apply to whoever's manufacturing that, whether that would be your own kitchen or whether that would be some contract manufacturer, that there is a food safety standard that has to be certified. And then there's also things like HACCP levels of food safety that are all regulated. And so you need to actually have certified, regulated facilities to manufacture your product in. Can you speak a little bit about that so that the average brand owner gets a general gist of what that is?
Yes. So for meat and poultry, if you're processing meat and poultry and you're selling a consumer packaged good, you need to, by law, you need to be under USDA grant of inspection. So you have to be regulated and inspected by USDA, or that food wouldn't be legal. There are also cerulliform fish, a certain type of fish that is under USDA as well, meat, poultry, and cerulliform. So you would have to be inspected by USDA. You would have to have a USDA bug on the package that has the establishment number, right? And you'd have to meet, of course, as we talked about prior, the labeling criteria that meet the USDA requirements. So there are those considerations when you're under USDA. So you need to be under USDA grant of inspection. When you're under FDA inspection, you have to in United States now you have to register as a food establishment, as an FDA food establishment under the FDA preventive controls rule, the new laws here. And so that if you're not registered with FDA, you're in trouble. And so there are also additional registrations under FDA if we are processing low acid canned foods or acidified foods. There are also additional registrations with them that by law have to be met. So when we cross over, if we're making that potato chip and we decide, and we're under FDA jurisdiction, and we decide we're going to make a chicharrone that's under USDA, we can't just start frying up chicharrones and selling them without being under USDA grant of inspection. And so we have to think about all those regulatory buckets. And when we transition to another bucket and we don't know it, that can be a problem. And especially for entrepreneurs who are new to the food and beverage or inventing novel things. If we're doing a potato chip and then we decide we're going to do a potato chip and anchovy flavored, or an anchovy potato chip, all of a sudden we migrated from FDA preventive controls on the potato chip to possibly a seafood HACCP rule. And so we shifted a little bit regulatory buckets, and we need to make sure we satisfy the FDA seafood HACCP rules if anchovy is in the common and usual name of that potato chip. So that's the trick to it, is to understand the bucket that you fall under, to make sure that the inspection that's performed, that the inspectors and the regulatory bodies know that you are operating under their jurisdiction. So, and then they audit you. And so a regulatory audit would be mandatory. And they tell you what their audit expectations are, and they'll tell you the frequency, the requirements, and all about that. And so as a foundation to operate in the United States, we have to be under our regulatory rule, whichever one it is. And then the other audits that you talked about that are more third-party audits. Mm-hmm. So they're audits that are not performed by the regulation body, but by a third party, and in accordance with third-party requirements like SQF, Safe Quality Foods, or like BRC, the British Retail Consortium. There are others, but when we operate under a third party, that's usually an elective requirement that we follow, and we usually do that to get to help us make sure that we, as manufacturers, that we meet regulatory criteria as we should, and so that we can demonstrate that we're meeting customer industry practice criteria. SQF, Safe Quality Foods, and BRC are sort of worldwide standards under the GFSI, Global Food Safety Initiative. And those are audit schemes that are third-party schemes that really can give your customers, whether you're selling to a retailer or a supermarket chain, or you're co-packing for somebody else, that you have confidence that you're meeting those regulatory criteria, and also that you're meeting customer criteria for both food safety and food quality.
Yes. So those So those governing bodies and those certificates, basically, they certify that you have been following those standards, and it's a second opinion to confirm that all of the plans that need to be in place to make sure that everything that you're creating is going to be safe and clean and to the highest standards possible. Those food safety certificates are basically assuring the consumer and yourself as the brand owner that all those requirements have been met by your manufacturer.
Yes, yes. And you'll often have your biggest customers, or if you want to sell into a big retail chain, they'll often tell you, okay, we love your product. We tasted your samples. It looks great. And we require as a condition of trade sale to us that you meet all of your regulatory criteria, but also that you undergo this third-party audit, and that you give us, a copy of the report and the outcome of that. And so that's often a trade requirement that's elective. It's third party. It's beyond regulatory. It's sort of a layer on top of the regulatory requirements, that it's a foundation.
Right. So you're talking about like how Costco might require a third-party inspection to their specific standards?
Yes. Yes.
And have their own auditing body come in and look at your facility to make sure that everything manufactured is up to certain standards. So this is applicable to any brand owner, because you need to realize that you can't just start making something in your kitchen. If you are going to do some product in a kitchen that is going to be sold to the public, it needs to submit under some regulatory standards, and it's very likely that you would need to be auditing yourself, which is a ton of work. And so the other option is to go to a contract manufacturer that very likely is in a manufacturing specific category. So maybe they're making meats regularly, or they are making cheeses regularly. So that means that they themselves are submitting to and following specific legal requirements for that category. And they very likely will already be submitting themselves under an auditing body to be sure that they can keep all their customers. So it's important to realize that there needs to be, anywhere that you're making food or beverages, there needs to be a plan that is set in place and followed every single time something is made, so that you're meeting the governing body requirements, and you can get certificates and audits to make sure that that's in place and to prove to everybody that it's safe.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Okay. Well, all of that is so good, because it's basically, it sounds like so much information, but it's covering the surface of what a food and beverage brand owner would need to understand, the basics, just the basics, to be able to start talking about creating and launching a product.
Yes.
So I appreciate, Melissa, you giving us this broad overview and giving us some information. And I want to be sure that anyone who has more in-depth questions can get answers. So can you tell me where they can reach out to your lab or to you for consulting? How can people get hold of you?
Yes, our website is a great place to go. The laboratory is labs.com, and we have ways to reach us. Myself, Carolyn Gonzalez, the lab director, Chelsea, our analytical services manager, and contact us on there. Please feel free to do that. The consulting firm, where we're working on, where we work on helping shelf life, stability, all those sorts of things. That is, you can go to our website for food safety solutions, and that's www.foodsafetysolutions, plural, solutions.us. It's not a .com, it's a .us. And if you go on there, our contact information is on there. Kathy Wilmus, there's a client services at foodsafetysolutions.us. and also contact for Kathy Wilmus, who's our Director of Operations. And she's the one who directs traffic and takes calls and questions and all that kind of stuff to get us connected up with people who have questions and who we can either, if there's consult questions on shelf life or contamination or whatever it might be, or regulatory compliance, or whether it's on the food microlabs side, Chelsea can get everybody. Chelsea might be the one who would contact you, and it would. We would love to help anybody with questions. I'm so delighted that you asked all these questions, Emily, because really often it's the case that when I'm talking with new food and beverage entrepreneurs, startups, or who are changing what they're doing or adding things, we have these very same types of conversations. And so the benefit of this, I hope this was beneficial for you and all of your clientele and all your subscribers, because it's really, I think, knowing where the general direction of where you need to get to is really the first part. And if you have some missteps there, it can slow you down, and it can result in headaches. And however we could mitigate that and help that, we're delighted.
Yes, Melissa, and you're always such a cheerful problem solver. You like to troubleshoot. So that's why I think you're really a great asset for people. And so we will post the links to Food Micro Labs and also to Food Safety Solutions, the consulting agency, in the bio below so people can reach out to you. And I just really appreciate your time. And so if anyone else has other questions, they can click those links and go learn a little bit more. And I hope that this helps you as a food brand owner who's watching to know a little bit more about where to start for food safety. Hope you have a great day and that you get to sell a lot of cool products.